Hello, my friends. There was a catastrophic event in the 1800s, which we all see today. Now, we see that today, over 200 years later, the aftermath of it. Now, in the pictures of the 1800s that we see, the 1850s and 40s, 50s, 60s, we notice that all these places are mud flooded throughout the entire world. Liquefaction of some kind, some sort of an event, worldwide happened. And we see this. Now, it's not recorded in history books that this happened worldwide and it was a big event. However, it is recorded. It's just hidden in plain sight. Now, the New Madrid fault, the New Madrid earthquake in the United States, was the most extravagant of all that happened at that time. So, we notice that there's a pattern here. When the comets come, things happen. Don't know why. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Who knows, right? But it's very odd that this was almost in a way hidden. Now, maybe some of you may know about it, but when I went to school, there was Halley's Comet, and that's it. They did not discuss the fact that there was worldwide consequences in the 1800s of one that came, the brightest, the most illuminated, the scariest one ever. Now, these comets appear to be just like a flashlight in water or in fog. They're very, very strange. They're very strange in the fact that their movement is very odd. Now, we're not going to get into that, but just comets in themselves are very strange to me. I don't know really what to make out of it, but that's a different video. Now, this great comet of 1811 is documented very, very well, but not by scholars and scientists, mainly by eyewitnesses. And they list it as the Great Comet of 1811, designated C1811F1, a comet that was visible to the naked eye for 260 days, the longest recorded period of visibility until Halley's Comet. In October of 1811, it was the brightest it had ever been, and basically, you could see it throughout the entire world. I just find that very odd, but okay. They discovered it on March 25th, 1811. I'm not going to even attempt to say that man's name. But this thing comes down around every 3,065 years is what they said, that's alleged orbit, okay? You know me, I don't believe in orbits and stuff like that, but I do believe in time and clock faces. And if it comes around every 3,065 years, then obviously we're not flying through outer space because it would never come back. But it was very weird because Tecumseh comes up. Now, if you don't know who Tecumseh is, this was an Indian chief. Now, this chief was the chief of the Shawnee. And his name, ominously, they say, his name ominously means shooting star, or he who walks across the sky. Now, Tecumseh's brother, who is a religious leader known as the Prophet, had predicted a solar eclipse in 1806, and he actually did it. It was like a miracle, right? And they say that astronomers came and told him that it was going to happen. That's how he became a prophet. So the story of Tecumseh, the Tecumseh's comet, and it also was Napoleon's comet in Europe, but in America it was Tecumseh's. Really odd, right? Well, so this comet in New Madrid, here in the United States, in Missouri, okay, it says, the New Madrid earthquake started December 16th of 1811 with the comet in the sky, all the way through March of 1812. There were over 2,000 quakes in the central Midwest and between 6,000 and 10,000 quakes in the Boot Hill of Missouri, in the New Madrid area. And in the history of the world, no other quakes have lasted so long or have produced more damage as the New Madrid did. Now, 3 quakes were America's strongest ever to date. December 16th of 1811, there was an 8.1 on the Richter scale. January 23rd of 1812, the magnitude was 7.8. And again on February 7th, 1812, the magnitude was 8.8. And on February 7th, the quake The Mississippi River ran backwards, and it did that from land upheaval, 15 miles south of the epicenter. And it created a lake that we now I actually fished there and been there a lot, called Reelfoot Lake. Well, this event on February the 7th, when it turned the river against itself to flow backwards, and thousands of acres of virgin forest and everything was destroyed, it created two waterfalls in the Mississippi River. Not to mention the inhabitants of an entire Indian village was wiped off the face of the earth. Now, God bless their souls, right? But two waterfalls in the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River is known as the Old Man River. It's so slow. There's no rapids in there. So to have two waterfalls in it, very odd. But New Madrid area, it had 2,000 quakes in 5 months. It opened up crevices north to south. And people came up missing, and they were said to have been swallowed up by the earth. Some of the open fissures were 5 miles long, and they had no idea how deep they were. There were sand boils where sand boiled out of the ground. One of them, in fact, is 1.4 miles long and 136 acres of sand. Known today. There were also seismic tar balls. Very odd, right? Pellets up to golf ball size are found in sand boils and fissures, and it is petroleum that has been solidified, and they call it petroliferous nodules. Never heard of them. Earthquake lights. Lights blasted from the ground, caused by quartz crystals being squeezed. The phenomenon is called seismoluminescence. Never heard of that before either. Warm water flew up out of the ground, and it was said to be warm to lukewarm. It's speculated that the shaking of the heated the water up, and the quartz light heated it too. Never heard of that. Earthquake smog. Imagine that. Skies turned completely black during the quakes, so dark that lit lamps did not help. The air was thick with smoke and smog, and it smelled of sulfur. It was hard to breathe it. It was speculated just to be smog. I don't know how they have smog. I don't understand that, but okay, let's go with it. Thunder, right? This is loud sounds of distant thunder, and giant explosions accompanied the quakes. Now, is that not weird, right? Well, okay. Animals acted weird before it happened. They said that, normally, your animals would get excited or what have you, but it was very weird. They said domestic animals became wild and wild animals became tame. They didn't even want to fight or nothing. They just came running to the humans. It's very weird, right? Snakes came out of their hibernation from the ground. Flocks of ducks and geese landed beside people and tried to, they were like, hey, human, what's going on, right? But this comet, right, it came, and it was literally visible to the entire Earth for 17 months. And allegedly, like I said, the 3,065-year orbit that it has. The last time that it came around was when Ramses II was around. And they called it Tecumseh's Comet here in America and Napoleon's Comet in Europe. Now, Tecumseh was a Shawnee Indian. Like I said, his name means shooting star or the one who walks across the sky. And there was a lot going on then. That's just another video. Very strange occurrences happened that day, that month, that year. But more strange than anything are the eyewitness accounts. The eyewitness accounts of what happened. What happened that day, that night, those nights, those 3 big major earthquakes, what happened in between them. They are very strange, just to say the least. Okay, so we'll read a few of these. Now, I won't read all of them. I'll post all of them for you so that you can, just go back and look at them, what have you. But I won't bore you with all of it. But just the main ones that tell you what happened that day, just very scary too. Now, this is a lady that was there, okay? And she writes in, Dear Sir, in compliance with your request, I will now give you a history as full in detail as the limits of a letter will permit of the late awful visitation of Providence in this place and its vicinity. On the 16th of December, 1811, about 2 a.m., we were visited by a violent shock of an earthquake, accompanied by a very awful noise resembling loud but distant thunder, but more hoarse and vibrating. The noise resembling loud but distant thunder, but more hoarse and vibrant. Okay, I get it. Sorry. Which was followed in a few minutes by the complete saturation of the atmosphere with sulphurous vapor, causing total darkness. The screams of the frightened inhabitants running to and fro, not knowing where to go or what to do. The cries of the fowls and beasts of every species. The cracking of trees falling and the roaring of the Mississippi River. The current. Uh, see next. It says it formed a scene truly horrible. From that time until about sunrise, a number of lighter shocks occurred, at which time one still more violent than the first took place, with the same accompaniments as the first, and the terror which had been excited in every one, and indeed in all animal nature, was now, if possible, doubled. The inhabitants fled in every direction to the country, supposing, if it can be admitted to their minds were exercised at all, that there was less danger at a distance from this, near the river. And one person, a female, the alarm was so great she fainted and could not be recovered. Her heart failed her. There were several shocks in the day, but lighter than those already mentioned until the 23rd of January, 1812, when one occurred as violent as the severest of the former ones, accompanied by the same phenomenon as the former. From this time until the 4th of February, the earth was in continual agitation, visibly waving as a gentle sea. On that day there was another shock, nearly as hard as the preceding ones. Next day, 4, and then about 7th, about 4 o'clock a.m. A concussion took place so much more violent than those which had preceded it that it was denominated the heart. I don't know, I'm not sure what that means. The awful darkness of the atmosphere, which was formerly as saturated with sulphurous vapor, and the violence of the uh, tempestuous thundering noise that accompanied it, together with all the phenomena mentioned as attending the former ones, formed a scene, the description of which would require the most sublimely fanciful imagination. Wow, right? It says, at first the Mississippi River began to recede from its banks, and its waters gathering up like a mountain, leaving for a moment many boats which were here on their way to New Orleans on the bare sand, in which time the poor sailors made their escape from them, and then rising 15 or 20 feet perpendicularly and expanding as it were at the same moment, the banks were overflowed with retrograde current, rapid as a torrent. The boats which before had been left on the sand were now torn from their moorings and suddenly driven up a little creek at the mouth of which they laid. The distance in some instances of nearly a quarter of a mile, the river falling immediately as rapid as it has risen, recorded within its banks again with such violence that it took with it whole groves of young cottonwood trees which were located in its borders. They were broken off with such regularity in some instances that persons who had not witnessed the fact would be difficultly persuaded that it has not been the work of art. A great many fish were left on the banks, being unable to keep pace with the water. The river was literally covered with the wrecks of boats, and it said that one was wrecked and there was a lady and 6 children, all of whom were lost. And all the hard shocks mentioned, the earth was horribly torn to pieces. The surface of hundreds of acres was from time to time covered over of various depths by the sand which issued from the fissures, which were made in great numbers all over this country, some of which closed up immediately after they had formed forth their sand and water, which it would be remarked was the matter generally thrown up. In some places, however, there was a substance somewhat resembling coal or impure stone coal, thrown up with the sand. It is impossible to say what the depth of the fissures or irregular breaks were. We have reason to believe. We have reason to believe. Gosh, it's so hard to read this. I apologize. Uh, what does it say? That I guess this is, some of them were very deep. The site of this town was evidently settled down at least 15 feet and not more than half a mile below the town. There does not appear to be any alteration on the bank of the river. Uh, a small difference, the numerous large ponds and lakes, as they were called, which covered a great part of the country, were nearly dried up. The beds of some of them are elevated above their banks several feet, producing an alteration of 10, 15, or 20 feet from the original state. See, this is what happened, y'all. This was a event that happened that was so magnificent, but why would it not be recorded, right? We were constrained by the fear of our houses falling, uh, to live what is it, 12 or 18 months after the first shock. That's a long, it's like for a year and a half, these people were freaked out because, you know, most of those who fled the country in the time of the hard shocks have since returned home. We've since, let's see, 1811. Okay, let's go to the next one. The next person. This would be Lorenzo's journal. It says, our boat got aground near this bluff, but two men came along in a canoe and helped us off. Then we struck a planter and split and hung the boat, which was a difficulty, which got off and mended, whatever. And this says, I quit her, paying my fare, and took another. It says, there are but few inhabitants for several hundred miles, Indians or whites, degenerated to their level. There are natural canals in the Mississippi River and to the Red River, and so to the sea, far west of New Orleans in the map. This country is little but understood. 10 companies are now surveying the public. At length, I landed at Natchez, which is Mississippi. Obtained several letters, and basically he went north. This is the guy that got on a steamboat, one of the first steamboats that were around. And he says, I have now, sir, finished my promised description of the earthquake. Imperfect, it is true, but just as it occurred to my memory, many of and most of the truly awful scenes having occurred 3 or 4 years ago, they are of course not related with that precision which could entitle to the character of a full and accurate picture. But such as it is, it's given with pleasure and the full confidence. See, they all say that it was so horrible. Well, we see earthquakes now, but they don't seem to be like this earthquake. This is very odd. Especially, there's no plate here. There's no boundary for their, non-existent plate tectonics. There's nothing there. It's several hundred miles away from any kind of plate, if not 1,000 miles away from plates. So it says, there is one circumstance which I think worthy of remark. This country was formerly subject to very hard thunder, but for more than a 12-month before the commencements of this earthquake, there was none at all, and but very little since, a great part of which resembles subterraneous thunder. The shocks still continue, but are growing more light and less frequent. The vibration of the earth shook down trees. Thousands of willows were swept off like a pipe stem, about waist high, and the swamps became high ground, and high land became low ground. And 2 islands in the river were so shaken they were washed away and sunk as not to be found. After speaking once descended to the iron banks, acres of which had been shaken down, the effects of which were awfully... okay. And it says, after speaking once descended to the iron banks, acres of which had been shaken down, the effects of which were awfully impressive, being very high, some trees, the tops just above water, others just ready to fall and slide off. There are many sawyers in this river, i.e. trees fashioned by the branches or roots in the bottom of the river, which saw up and down by virtue of the pressing of the water, while others are so firm as not to all yield to the current. Those things make it dangerous going at night or in the fog. We lay by 2 nights and day, the wind and fog being our hindering cause. New Madrid had been designed as the metropolis of the New World, but God sees not as man sees. Isn't it weird, right? It is deserted by most of its inhabitants. The upper Chickasaw Bluff does not wash like the others, and probably will be fixed upon one day as a proper site to convene the portage up and down the river, which now is inconvened by the Indians owning the soil, or the inundation of the water. From New Madrid to New Orleans, there is no high ground for settlements on the west side of the river. The high water flows back in some places 30 or 40 miles, rising 50 feet, and the Ohio 65 feet. Wow, it's amazing, y'all. These are so hard to read. I apologize if they don't come out. I hope they do. It says the National Intelligencer, Washington City, Saturday, March 14th, 1812. This is from an eyewitness, D.I. Bettinger. He was a captain on a ship, or on one of the barges here, and there was about 4 or 5 barges with him at the time that this happened. And this is his account. He says, December 16th, about 2 o'clock in the morning, we were alarmed by an unusual noise seeming under the bottom of the barge, attended with a violent trembling and shaking of the vessel, and as the boats and company were at the same time equally affected, and all were soon convinced that the cause was no other than a violent shock of an earthquake which lasted, without intermission, about 40 seconds, immediately after which the boats rolled considerably, though there was no wind. The river appeared to be much agitated. It was suddenly covered with a thick froth. It rose at least 18 inches in a few minutes' time, and it became very rapid until daylight. It didn't make any sense. I apologize. Nothing material occurred except repeating rumbling sounds, seemingly at a distance, and continual falling in the banks of the river. The boats now all got under way and stood down the river. The thermometer at sunrise was still at 45. No perceptible change was observed in the temperature of the river water. Nothing was seen like lightning, fire, smoke, or anything of the volcanic nature. The weather remained dark and cloudy, and the winds were light and variable. About 7:30 a.m., there was another shock, which for violence it was agreed by all on board exceeded the first, but it lasted only about 20 seconds. Soon after was seen, a short distance from the headmost boat, a large spout or body of water rising from the river to the height of about 18 to 20 feet, when it seemed to burst and was instantaneously followed by a loud report. Similar reports were heard from the neighboring low grounds at various distances from the river. A great number of old logs and trees of enormous size were cast up to the surface from the bottom of the channel, which caused the navigation, always difficult here, to be more dangerous. The mischief done by these logs cannot be ascertained. It says it was afterwards concluded that as the froth was eventually produced by the ebullitions, ebullitions, or whatever, the ebbs and or bubbling of water formed during the concussions from the bottom of the sides of the river, through innumerable ducts of openings as it floated off down the stream into short space of time, the most violent effects of the earthquake, says, could not be extended on the river to any great distance above this place. I apologize. Some of that doesn't make any sense, and I'm not sure if it's me that can't make sense of it or what. It says they continued their course down the river. At 11 o'clock, they felt a considerable shock, and 20 minutes after, another one. Not so severe. The thermometer at 3 p.m. was at 52. In the evening, all boats in company came to near the island number 23. A landing was made on this island, and it was found that every part of the beach, as well as high land, had been much rent and torn to pieces. Numerous springs or holes remained, which all the appearance of having discharged large quantities of water, sand, mud, and pieces of wood, which in color and weight greatly resembled mineral coal. Some specimens were brought away. On December 17th, the thermometer was 53 degrees. The wind west, blah, 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 descended the river this day to the head of the Canadian Reach. At 6 a.m., two shocks, each of short duration. At 30 minutes past 11, one more violent, occasional rumblings. December 18th, it was 30 degrees, remained anchored. A clear day, proceeded to the first Chickasaw Bluff and landed. On the high ground, discovered no marks of the earthquake near the riverbanks. Nothing was broken, not like those of Little Prairie. This is another eyewitness. Let's see. Now, this is from Mississippi Valley Authority. This is an official paper here. It says, it was on the night of the 16th of December, 1811, when the first shock occurred. The weather had been warm and pleasant, and the air was filled with that peculiar haze characteristic of the Indian summer, except that it was more damp. About midnight, while the French, who constituted, a bulk of the population of New Madrid, were engaged in dancing and frolicking, the first shock came on, and it was of sufficient violence to shake down many of the houses and fences. The greatest consternation prevailed. The entire population rushed into the open air, and there, in the midnight darkness, and upon the rocking earth, Protestant and Catholic, side by side, knelt down and offered to the mightiest solemn supplication, for, in that fearful hour, human aid was unveiling. The shocks. See, it scared these people so bad, they thought it was the end of the world, right? The shocks, my informant continued, extended over a period of 20 or 30 months. Sometimes they would come on gradually and finally culminate. Again, they would come without premonition and in terrific force, then gradually subside. In every instance, the motion was propagated from the west or southwest. Fissures would be formed 600 or 700 feet in length and 20 or 30 feet in breadth, through which water and sand would spout out in the height of 40 feet. There issued no burning flames, but flashes, such as a result of explosions of gas or from the passage of the electrical fluid from one cloud to another. I have seen oak trees which would be split in the center and 40 feet up the trunk, one part standing on the side of a fissure and the other part on the other, and trees are now standing which have been cleft in this manner. My grandfather had received a boatload of castings from Pittsburgh, which were stored in his cellar. During one of the shocks, the ground opened immediately under the house, and they were swallowed up, and no trace of them was afterwards obtained. God, that's scary, right? I regard the region as still subject to these agitations. A few years ago, I saw the effects sufficiently violent to shake the bark off the trees and to sway their tops to and fro. The region of St. Francis is peculiar. I have trapped there for 30 years. There is a great deal of sunken land caused by the earthquakes of 1811. There are large trees of walnut, white oak, and mulberry, such as grow on high land, which are now seen submerged 10, 20 feet beneath the water. In some of the lakes I have seen cypresses so far down beneath the surface that with a canoe I have paddled amongst the branches. Previous to the earthquakes, keel boats used to come up to the St. Francis River and pass into the Mississippi. At a point 3 miles below New Madrid, the bayou is now high ground. Yeah, there's some really crazy stuff. It says from one of the fissures formed during these convulsions was ejected the cranium of an extinct musk oxen, now in the possession of the Lyceum of Natural History of New York. Reelfoot Lake on the opposite shore, in Obion County, Tennessee, nearly 20 miles long and 7 broad, owes its origin to the sinking of the ground during this period. The trunks of the dead cypresses are seen standing in the water, and the fisherman, as he plies his occupation in his canoe, floats above the branch tops. Wow. Okay, and let's see here. Timothy Flint, eyewitness. From all the accounts, he says, connected one by another and compared with the very imperfect narratives which were published, I infer that the shock of these earthquakes in the immediate center of their force must have equaled, in the terrible heavings of the earth, anything of the kind that has been recorded. I do not believe that the public have ever yet had an adequate idea of the violence of the concussions. We are accustomed to measure this by the buildings overturned and the mortality that results. Here the country was thinly settled. The houses, fortunately, were frail and of logs, the most difficult to overturn that could be constructed. Yet, as it was, whole tracts were plunged into the bed of the river. The graveyard at New Madrid, with all its sleeping tenants, was precipitated into the bend of the stream. Most of the houses were thrown down. Large lakes, 20 miles in extent, were made in an hour. Other lakes were drained. The whole country, to the mouth of the Ohio in one direction and to the St. Francis in the other, including a front of 300 miles, was convulsed to such a degree as to create lakes and islands, the number of which is not known, and to cover a tract of many miles in extent, near the little prairie, with water, 3 or 4 feet deep. And, when the water disappeared, a stratum of sand and of the same thickness was left in place. Trees split in the mist and lashed one with another are still visible over great tracts of the country, inclining in every direction and at every angle to the earth and to the horizon. They describe the undulations of the earth as resembling waves, increasing in elevation as they advanced, and when they had attained a certain fearful height, the earth would burst, and the vast volumes of water and sand and pit coal were discharged as high as the tops of trees. I have seen 100 of these charms which remained fearfully deep, although in a very, I'm not sure what that says, alluvial soil, and after a lapse of 7 years, whole districts were covered with white sand, so as to become uninhabitable. The water at first covered the whole country, particularly at the little prairie, and it must indeed have been a scene of horror. In these deep forests and in the gloom of the darkest night, and by wading in the water in the middle for the inhabitants to fly from these concussions, which were occurring every few hours, with a noise equally terrible to birds, beasts, as to man. The birds themselves lost all power and disposition to fly, and retreated to the bosoms of men, their fellow sufferers in the general convulsion. It's so weird that the animals ran to the humans. A few persons sank in these chasms and were provincially extricated. Oh, one person died of fright, and one perished miserably on an island which retained its original level in the midst of the wide lake created by the earthquake. Oh, God. A number perished who sank with their boats in the river. Bursting of the earth just below the village of New Madrid arrested the mighty stream in its course and caused a reflux of its waves, by which, in a little time, that the great number of boats were swept by the ascending current into the mouth of the bayou, carried out and left upon the dry earth, where the accumulated waters of the river had again changed the current. There were a great number of severe shocks, but 2 series of concussions were particularly terrible, far more so than the rest, and the remark that the shocks were clearly distinguishable in two classes, those in which the motion was horizontal and those in which it was perpendicular. The latter were attended with the explosions and the terrible mixture of noises that preceded and accompanied the earthquakes in a louder degree, but were uh, so desolating and destructive as the other. When they were felt, the houses crumbled and the trees waved together, and the ground sank, and all the destructive phenomena was conspicuous, whatever it says. In the interval of the earthquakes, there was one evening, and that a brilliant and cloudless one, in which the western sky was continued glare of vivid flashes of lightning and of repeated peals of subterranean thunder, seeming to proceed, as the flashes did, from below the horizon. They remarked that the night, so conspicuous for subterranean thunder, was the same period in which the fatal earthquake of Caracas occurred, and they seemed to suppose those flashes and that event part of the same scene. Wow. Flint confirms the observations of others that chasms in the earth were in the direction from south to southwest to northwest, and were of an extent to swallow up not only men but houses, and that they frequently occurred in intervals of half a mile. The people felled the tallest trees at right angles to these chasms and placed themselves upon their trunks, which precaution many escaped destruction. For then once the earth opened beneath, and one would have engulfed them in the abyss. So great was the destruction of property, and so irretrievably ruined were many of the farms by this series of events, that Congress, at a subsequent day, passed a law granting to each proprietor who had sustained serious loss a section of land in what is known as the Boone Lick County, and condition of this relinquishing his desolation from farm to the government. Huh. So the government got all that land. Oh, is that not just a coincidence? Earthquake shocks yet occur in this region, and blasts of air and gas yet find their way to the surface through many of the half-filled fissures, but there has been no repetition of the terrible phenomena witnessed between 1811 and 1812. Now, I'll just read you one more. And this here is from a gentleman, it says, in New Orleans to his friend in Virginia, January 16th, 1812. I have in former letters made you acquainted with our progress as far as Baton Rouge, and in one from Port Pickering. Now, this let's see. On the morning of the 14th of December, we entered the Mississippi River in company with two other barges bound to this place. The river presented nothing unusual as to its banks, the stage of its water, or the velocity of its current. The wind, we could determine without compass, was southeast. The weather cloudy and dull. Let's see. We'll get on down to the bottom right here. It says at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 16th, when a sudden violent shaking of our vessels, accompanied with a dreadful clattering of everything loose on the board, and confused rumbling noise, roused all hands from their beds. The first and most general impression as to the cause was that we had dragged anchor and were then beating over a rough sandbar. This, however, was rendered improbable when it was recollected that it had been perfectly calm all night, and as soon as we found that the other vessels were affected in the same manner, and the same moment, our suspense was terminated, and the alarming conclusion rushed upon our minds that we had felt was none less than the shock of an earthquake. Our anxiety and our fears were now awakened, and everything became subject of observation and inquiry. The river had risen about 18 inches, and the water was smooth and almost still when we anchored, now hurried by us at the rate of 5 to 6 miles an hour, carrying upon its surface a thick froth. But in about 3 hours it returned to its former stage of tranquility. The duration of the shock was about 40 seconds, and there was no sensible alteration in temperature. It was excessively dark, and it had no emission of light was observed in any part of the horizon, nor could we discover the slightest impregnation of the atmosphere with smoke or anything whatsoever, although some of the sand bank near us, which was about 5 above the surface of the river, was continually falling in by sections in which it had been broken by the convulsions, whilst the disruption of immense bodies from the main bank on the other side, covered with heavy timber. It occasioned a most horrid crashing, and produced a swell in the river which caused our vessels to roll considerably. Reports like those of a musket in the woods were often heard, and sometimes heavy sound like distant explosions. A rumbling like distant thunder was heard every 20 or 30 minutes, but it seemed to fill the air so completely that it was impossible to say from what quarter it came from. There was no wind, but we heard a roaring upon the water at a distance. In a half an hour after the first, we felt a second shock. The duration was about 20 seconds, and 2 hours after the second was felt a third. and so on. Not so long nor severe, but both of which, however, made everything rattle and was loose that gave the vessel. Let's see. Thus passed slow and dismal hours until day. But the hopes which the cheering influence of light had inspired our minds were soon blasted. At 7:30, soon after getting under way, we felt a fourth shock, as violent as the first, but it did not continue so long. Immediately after this, Mr. B saw a body of water 200 or 300 yards from our vessel, and about 100 from the bank, rise to the height of about 20 feet and fell with a loud report. It appeared to be about the size and figure of a common haystack. He called to me to look, but I could not direct my attention to the spot sooner. It doesn't make sense. I guess some of this is not good English here. Appeared to be the rising figure of a common haystack. Called me to look, but I could not direct my attention. Okay, to the spot sooner to see the agitation of the water where it had fallen. The report was heard, I believe, by everybody on board. A large log or body of a tree, about 60 feet long, was thrown up very near to us, and at the same time there appeared to be a boiling motion in the water, which brought up swayers and planters, as well as small fragments of wood, bark, leaves, etc., and numerous air bubbles. The water was very muddy and frothy. Here the falling of large trees and masses of the bank covered with cane kept a perpetual echo, like the retiring sound after a severe peal of thunder. We heard loud reports far in the swamp and a noise like wind passing furiously through the woods. These added to the darkness and gloom of the weather, the solemnity of every countenance, of perfect silence and stillness of everything on board, presented to the mind a scene inexpressibly awful. Every 30 or 40 minutes after the fourth shock, we felt slighter ones and tremblings of our vessel, succeeded by the distant rumbling. Between 10 and 11:30, we felt 3 tremblings of slight shocks. Mr. B and myself went into the boat near the shore of the little prairie, a small settlement on the west bank, and the inhabitants had fled from their houses in great terror. A man who told us that he was the only person there in the place informed us that the swamp at the back of the prairie was completely inundated, that the fourth shock was much more severe than preceded the ones, and that it damaged all their houses and thrown down the only brick chimney. The bank was very much broken, and the extensive longitudinal fissures, and we saw water gushing out several transverse ones. Wow. Well, okay. One more. Let's see. From James Fletcher, in whose statement we place the utmost reliance, we have received the following narrative. He says, at the Little Prairie, a beautiful spot on the west side of the Mississippi River, about 30 miles from New Madrid, on the 16th of December, about 2 o'clock a.m., we felt a severe concussion of the earth, which we supposed to be occasioned by the distant earthquake, and did not apprehend much damage. Between that time and the day, we felt several other slighter shocks. About sunrise, another very severe one came on, and attended with a perpendicular bouncing that caused the earth to open in many places, some 8 and 10 feet wide, numbers of less width, and of considerable length. Some parts have sunk much lower than others. Where one of these large openings are, one side remains as high as before, and the shock that the other is sunk. Some more, some less, but the deepest I saw was about 12 feet deep. The earth was, in the course of 15 minutes after the shock in the morning, entirely inundated with water. The pressing of the earth, if the expressions be allowable, caused the water to spout out of the pores of the earth, to the height of 8 or 10 feet. We supposed the whole country sinking, and knew not what to do for the best. The agitation of the earth was so great that it was with difficulty any could stand on their feet, some could not. The air was very strongly impregnated with a sulphurous smell. As if by instinct, we flew as soon as we could from the river, dreading most danger there, but after rambling about 2 or 3 hours, about 200 gathering at Captain Francis Lusker's, where we encamped, until we heard that the upper country was not damaged. When I left the camp, after staying there for 12 days, to look for some other place, and there was 3 days getting about 30 miles from being obliged to travel. I'm not sure why that's so hard. I don't know. It seems hard to read to me. I apologize. It says, previously to my leaving the country, I heard that many parts of the Mississippi River had caved in some places several acres at the same instant. But the most extraordinary effect that I saw was a small lake below the river St. Francis, the bottom of which had blown up higher than any of these adjoining country, and instead of water it is filled with a beautiful white sand. The same effect is produced in many other lakes, or I am informed by those who saw them, and it is supposed that they are generally filled up. A little river called Pimesky, Pimesk, Pimesk, that empties into the St. Francis and runs parallel with the Mississippi at a distance about 12 miles from it, is filled also with sand. I only saw it near its bend and found it to be so, and it was informed to be respectable gentlemen who had seen it lower down, and it was positively filled with sand. On the sand that was thrown out of the lakes and rivers lies numerous quantities of fish and all kinds of and of all kinds common to the country. The damage to stock was unknown. I heard of only two dwelling houses, a granary and a smokehouse, being sunk. One of the dwelling houses was sunk 12 feet below the surface of the earth. The other, to the top, was even with the surface. The granary and smokehouse were entirely out of sight. We suppose sunk and the earth closed up over them. Oh God. The buildings through the country were also damaged. We heard of no lives being lost except 7 Indians who were shaken into the Mississippi. This we learned from one who escaped. Previous to the shocks coming on, we heard a rumbling noise like that of thunder. They continued till I left the country, some very sincere. I cannot tell how many there were. Wow. So I'll leave all these up here so that you can, get them and read through them yourself. They're pretty amazing. Something happened in 1811 and 1812 that was very, very drastic. We see the effects in Memphis. A lot of Memphis, Tennessee, and all through Missouri, all around our areas, is all mud flooded. We also see where the river had went several miles inland. There's another bank of the river that is we call the Old Levee, and yeah, so this was a very, very strange event that happened, and it's not known by scientists how this happens because when you look into the earthquakes, if it's not on an actual fault line, well then they have no idea how it happens. And it happened, and there were reports of, cannon fire. They said that it was reports of explosions. Some of them were so great that it scared the hell out of these people. They thought they were being attacked. So, the captains, the people who were in the military, thought they were being attacked because they thought it was cannon fire going off and these explosions with the lights everywhere and the craziness that happened. I just think that, we're not being told a lot of what happened by the mainstream because it goes against everything that they know about earthquakes. And that's one of the reasons why you never hear about these things. Because I know you've all seen the earthquakes lately and what's happened. Those were peanuts compared to what happened in the 1800s. So that's my video. Just wanted to show you that I kind of think I know what happened in the 1800s that caused the mud flood, that caused these problems, and how the sand came out of the ground and the explosions that blew up, and you couldn't even see, and it was dark outside after that, along with this comet that came by too. It's just very odd, very strange, because we live in a crazy world, right? So, yep. Well, I hope you enjoy it, and take care of yourself. Love you all. I'm Wild Dog, and I am out of here.